Okay folks, I want to explain why the title of this video, in my opinion, is a little bit silly. Can anyone really take all the lures in bass fishing, limit them down to just 5, and make them perfectly apply to the body of water that you fish during the month of July? I don't think so. We live in a huge country with so much variation in terms of weather and water conditions, and so if I was to give you a list of just 5 for the month of July, it would be insufficient to truly help you as an angler. In today's video, I'm going to share with you guys my top list of lures for each region of the country, whether you're fishing for bass in South Florida or upstate New York, and whether you're on the bank or in the bass boat. My name's Tyler, and let's talk about it. Another giant, another giant. Look at that, y'all. I can't believe what I just caught. Yes! How's it going, folks, and welcome back to TRF. My goal here on this channel is to help you guys become better bass anglers and catch more fish. So if that's what you like, hit that subscribe button. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, we're gonna talk about 3 main sections of the United States. I'm gonna talk about the South region, the Central region, and the North region. Where I'm getting my inspiration from for these regions is on the Strike King Lures website. Strike King and Lures, in conjunction with their tour pros on MLF and Bassmaster, every single month have 6 individual zones separating the United States that pros give input on which lures are working during those months for those zones. It is an awesome resource. I will have it linked in the video description. Now, this video is sponsored by the BassForecast app. More on what they do and how they help you select your lures no matter where you are based on weather and GPS. I will talk about them more in the video. So let's hop into our first region, the Southern region. Here in the South, it's been hot. It's been that way for a while, and it's not gonna change anytime soon. So how does this hot weather affect bass? Well, I'm gonna talk about that in a separate video in more detail, but as a general overview answer, hot weather and hot water makes fish go deep. That weather pushes fish into deeper water and deeper into heavy cover like grass and wood up shallow. And the hotter the water gets for the longer period of time, the more lethargic and less active your bass become. Bass has a certain temperature of water they can thrive in, and in the southern region, it's been really hot for too long. The first lure is going to be a topwater frog. The reason why I choose a topwater frog is because whether you are bank fishing in a pond or fishing from a bass boat, there is always some kind of shallow, heavy cover to throw a topwater around, and a frog is really the only one that is suited for that environment. A treble hook topwater, oftentimes a buzzbait, they're not really meant for heavy grass, lily pads, lay down logs and timber. A frog is the only topwater you can actually throw around those areas. And I know I said that hot water and hot weather makes fish go deep, but there's still a certain percentage of bass that want to live shallow, and so they have to go into that cover the farthest they can. And in those morning time periods, you can still get them to come up and hit a topwater frog. So whether you are fishing the bank or from the bass boat or a kayak, a frog is the best topwater for the southern region. Sticking in the vein of shallow cover, we're going to talk about punching bait. So I'm talking about heavy jigs and heavy Texas rigs. Now, this is less targeted at bank fishermen as it is bass boat fishermen, but bass love to get underneath submerged, matted vegetation. So if you have any kind of lily pads or hydrilla or milfoil that has grown to the top of the water and formed kind of a canopy, fish will live underneath that canopy, and the only way to get your bait in there is by using a technique called punching. If you're unfamiliar with what punching is, I will leave an instructional for that linked in the video description. Punching is a fantastic way to catch them. My third lure to catch bass in the southern region is going to be a big worm. Now, I think by this point, everybody has seen my big worms video. As a matter of fact, it's got like 75,000 views. But if you haven't, I would highly recommend you go watch that one. And as always, I will leave all these videos for every single lure that I talk about in the video description. I've got instructionals for all of these. But the reason why a big worm works so well in July in the southern region is because fish don't want to have to move a whole lot to eat, and they also want to eat a lot at one time. And a big worm satisfies both of those desires. Now, the next lure is going to be a drop shot, the polar opposite of a big worm. The only similarity that it shares is that they are both meant to be thrown in deeper water. So if you can't get your fish to commit to eating a big worm, or let's say you don't have that many big fish in your population, in your body of water, a drop shot is a great thing to throw, especially in clear water. If you're in a clear water pond, clear water lake, a drop shot is hard to beat on offshore rock, offshore grass, really anywhere that's deeper than, I'd say, 10 feet of water. With really any size drop shot worm from like 4 inches to 7 inches, that is a great thing to throw in July. And my last lure for the southern region in the month of July is going to be a deep crankbait. Sometimes fish are not lethargic, especially when they're in big groups together. So ledge fishing, hard spots, brush piles, this is really targeted toward the bass boat fishermen. a deep crankbait can get a big school of fish triggered up and catch multiple on back-to-back-to-back casts. And oftentimes you can use a deep crankbait and a drop shot basically in conjunction with each other for those extremely aggressive fish and those extremely lethargic fish. So those right there are my lure suggestions for you if you live in the southern region. Now, I live in the southern region, but I don't know it all. I don't fish all these lakes. I don't know about Florida that much. I don't know about Alabama that much, but there are YouTubers that do. And so some of my other favorite YouTubers that I'm gonna recommend you guys keep up with if you live in that southern region are Fishing with Nordby, Mikey Balls, and Gene Jensen, the Fluke Master. So I will leave all their videos linked below, and I will have other YouTubers for the other regions we're gonna talk about. Now, what is my biggest tip for the southern region in July? It is to get out there stinking early. Bass are going to be most active and most feeding from the hours of 5 a.m. to 7:30 in the morning. And so if you are not on the water during those times in a pond or in a bass boat, you're gonna have trouble catching fish. Now, sunset can also be a good time to catch them and during the night, but in my experience, for most people, getting out there early gives you a much better success rate. So that concludes the southern region. Now, I talked about earlier, this video is sponsored by an app that I use a whole lot. I am a co-owner of, and I helped design, and that is BassForecast. BassForecast is a fishing forecasting app that has everything you need to know as an angler in the palm of your hand. While other fishing lure recommendation apps have a whole lot of input you've got to put in yourselves on water clarity and cover structure type, this is literally so easy. You put in your location and it spits out the times that are best in terms of the moon phase. It spits out a rating based on 1 to 10 on how good the fish should be biting based on today's weather and 10 days of previous weather. It tells you which season your bass are most likely in based on weather and GPS data. And of course, it gives you a list of recommended lures to try and locations to throw those lures. And a little personal story about this app versus the others. I travel on the Major League Fishing Bass Pro Tour, and so I get to see how these pros dissect these bodies of water and what lures they are actually using to catch fish, not just what they're telling you they're using on social media. BassForecast has been absolutely dead on in terms of the locations and the lures these guys are throwing. And I can't say the same thing about the other fishing apps out there. They have not been nearly as accurate. If you don't believe me, put in the location of the tournament and test BassForecast versus the others. I guarantee you this will come out on top. Now, I say we hop on to the central region. Bass in this region finished spawning about a month or two ago, and so that means you're still gonna have some fish up shallow guarding fry. You're gonna have some fish actively feeding on bluegills as they spawn around bluegill beds, and you're gonna have some fish out deep. I'd say it's probably split 30-70. 30% of fish are still up shallow and 70% are out deep. And the reason for this is because the water temperature in this region never gets all that hot. It gets relatively warm, but doesn't get too hot to push the majority of fish out of shallow water. Shallow water is still relatively hospitable for a bass. Now, this region has the most variation in terms of all the lures you can throw, so let's talk about them. My first lure is going to be, once again, a topwater frog. And the reason for the frog is similar to the southern region, but not totally the same, because in the south, I talked about just being a shallow cover sort of thing. The fish have to be around that cover. In the central region, fish can live in more open water. So while I'm targeting in the south the frog around just shallow cover, shallow grass, shallow wood, I am tending to throw a topwater frog around other types of shallow water. So open water, maybe a grass flat, maybe just kind of in the general area of shallow cover, but not specifically next to it or on top of it. Fish will live around the cover and not just in it. And sticking in the vein of shallow water, a vibrating jig is still a great lure to throw in ponds and lakes in the central region in the month of July. A lot of these fish are still gonna be feeding on bluegills, and so a vibrating jig in shallow water, especially around docks, around flats of grass, bluegill are going to be either still spawning or finishing up, which means bass are still gorging themselves, at least the shallow water bass, on those bluegill. And the best way to cover water and catch fish, no matter the body of water you're in, is a vibrating jig. Sticking in the vein of jigs, a regular skipping jig is going to be fantastic as well. One of the best places to find bass in this central region, especially around big bodies of water, is on docks. So if you are in a kayak, a john boat, or a bass boat, and you're not fishing docks during the month of July, you need to be, especially as that sun gets up. Those shallow fish that can live in relatively open water, in shallow water, they're gonna move because they don't have any eyelids underneath those docks. And especially if you're in the Ozarks region, you can catch a whole lot of fish in July skipping docks with a jig. And while a deep diving crankbait was really the only viable option in terms of deeper moving lures for southern region, the central region is a little bit less defined than the southern region is, so you can actually get away with throwing a medium or a deep diving crankbait on a whole lot more situations. So points, humps, flats, ridges, anything that's from like 8 foot of water to 25, a crankbait can work great for. And just like the southern region, if you've got some fish that are lethargic out deep, a big worm and a drop shot can still catch them. And my last bait recommendations for the central region is going to be a topwater walking bait, because in this central region, the water temperature is oftentimes perfect for schooling fish.
Oh, doubled up! Yes!
Whether you're fishing from a bass boat or from the bank, if you have bait fish in your body of water, you're gonna see several times throughout this month, fish come up to the surface to basically push bait balls together and create what's called a schooling situation, where the fish are just gorging themselves on bait fish, oftentimes on topwater. So make sure you're keeping your eyes peeled and your ears open for schooling action and having a walking topwater bait ready to throw out there to get those fish to trigger. Now, while I do know a lot about the central region of the country, I don't live there, and my experience there is limited compared to some of these other YouTubers. So for the central region, my YouTubers to follow are going to be Tactical Bassin, that's a no-brainer, Alex Rudd Fishing, Edwin Evers, Colin J, and Fish the Moment. I feel like those channels in the central region give you a good instructional base for how to catch fish where you live. Now, what is my biggest tip for catching fish in the central region? It's also to get out there stinking early, but don't be afraid to mix things up. While in the southern region, things are kind of one-dimensional. Fish are tired, lethargic, fishing is getting harder and harder and harder. In that central region, there's still a lot of places you can catch fish and a lot of ways to do it. And so don't be afraid to switch up lures one day versus the other if fish aren't biting the way they were before. And the last region we have is the northern region. As July gets here, it is getting hot per se in the northern region now compared to what I live here in Texas. Minnesota, New York, it's not hot at all. But for you guys in your bodies of water, there is a relative version of hot. But that hot weather can only affect the water temperature so much. And so in the vast majority of cases, I'm talking about Ohio, New York, Minnesota, Michigan, you're still gonna have relatively hospitable water even in 1 foot. So what this means is that you can basically throw whatever lures you want, but there are some mainstays, some that I would really recommend if you live in the north to have the best possible fishing action. Now the first lure is going to be the exact same, and that is a topwater frog. Now the reason why I'm choosing that is not because of the weather or the water temperature specifically, but because if I can catch them exactly how I want to in the summer up north, I'm gonna throw a stinking frog. Now staying in the topwater vein, you can throw basically any other type of topwater you want. So you wanna throw a plopper? You can. You wanna throw a spook? You can. You wanna throw a buzzbait? You can. And you're gonna see me throw a ton of different topwaters up north this summer and fall. Now getting away from topwater, if you are in a pond or a bass boat in Minnesota, New York, you can throw whatever reaction bait you want. So I'm talking a spinner bait, a chatterbait, a underspin. I mean, you can throw whatever the heck you want as long as fish are shallow and active, which in most bodies of water they are, you can throw that. But just like in the central region, I tend to throw a vibrating jig, and the reason for that is because I think it gives the best imitation of a bluegill. Now, if you are in really shallow water around some shallow grass or wood, a vibrating jig is not a weedless lure, so a swim jig takes over, in my mind, as the best reaction moving bait for the northern region in the month of July. I catch a ton of fish, and big ones, on a swim jig. The reason why I love a swim jig is because it is extra finesse. Now, by throwing it out there, you wouldn't think a jig is finesse, but it moves through the water with a little bit of action on the claws and a little bit from the skirt, but it's not creating a vibration or a huge water push. As a matter of fact, it's basically silent. But if you've got shallow water you want to fish in the northern region in the month of July, you can bet your bottom dollar you can catch them on a swim jig. Now, even though catching them shallow is really fun in the summer up north, you can also catch them out deep, and oftentimes those fish are completely untouched. I speak from experience, and you're gonna see in my videos from Minnesota this summer, the offshore fish up north don't get touched. And to catch deep fish, my #1 lure, and not for finesse reasons, is a drop shot. Both largemouth and smallmouth bass up north love to eat a drop shot, and I throw it because it gets bit. So if you're having trouble catching fish in your ponds and lakes in the northern region, just whip out a drop shot and commit to it. And if you're fishing around any kind of docks or wood, you can throw whatever Texas rig or jig you want, whatever you have confidence in, do that. Now, what YouTubers do I recommend for this section of the country? First, we have Bass Fishing HQ. He's a great friend of mine and lives in Northern Ohio. Then we've got Debo's Fishing, a great lure and technique specific guy. We have Sam Sobey, Minnesota based, and Greg Blanchard, who's in Northern California. Now, I'm sure there are other regional YouTubers. That's just all that I can think of off the top of my head. And what is my biggest tip for catching bass in the northern region? It's going to be throw bluegill imitation baits, colors, and in locations where bluegills have been, are, or are going to be. There are some areas of northern Minnesota, northern Michigan, and northern New York where the bass are still spawning in July. So if the bass are still spawning, you can bet the bluegill haven't even started or are just starting spawning. And so that shallow area where the bluegills are is going to be the best place to target to catch fish in July. So that is going to be it for the video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, hit that subscribe button. I would love to have you along with us on the journey of bass fishing learning. Hey, if you want to see 2 previous videos that I actually mentioned in this video, my frog masterclass will be linked up here. It teaches you everything you've got to know about throwing a topwater frog. And if you want to know how to catch fish on a drop shot in the summertime, I will leave that video linked up here in this corner. As always, it's been a pleasure to teach you guys how to catch more fish. My name's Tyler, and we'll see you next time right here on TRF.